Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Reading with Grandma. We're continuing on our series of Once Upon a Time, Treasury of Fairy Tales. And today's story, it's a really old story, but I remember it as a child. It's called The Little Dutch Boy. There probably won't be a lot of you that know it. Your moms and dads might, but little children, it's a very good story of bravery and patience and courage. And I hope you all enjoy it. So let's get started with The Little Dutch Boy. Long ago there was a boy named Hans. He lived with his mother in a pretty little town in Holland. As you may know, the land in Holland was very flat and also lower than the sea. Dutch farmers have built high walls called dikes to keep the sea from flooding their farms. Like all Dutch children, little Hans knew that if the dike were to break, the fields would fill with seawater. The town would be ruined. One day, Hans's mother packed a lunch basket for him to take to their friend, Mr. Van Noten. He lived outside of town, and it was a very long walk to his house. Before Hans left, his mother reminded him to leave Mr. Van Noten's house in plenty of time to walk home before it got dark. On his way out of town, Hans followed the road that ran along the dike. After a time, he arrived at Mr. Van Noten's house. Mr. Van Noten lived alone, and he was always glad when Hans came for a visit. Hans was quite hungry after his long walk, so Mr. Van Noten made cocoa and set out the bread and cheese that Hans's mother had sent. After the meal, the boy and the old man talked by the fire. When Mr. Van Notten's dog scratched at the door to be let outside, Hans noticed that the sky had become dark and stormy. He knew he should leave before it began to rain. Although the boy walked quickly, he was not halfway home when the wind began to gust. A cold rain fell on Hans as he struggled against the wind. The weather made walking very difficult. "Put one foot in front of the other," he told himself. "You will soon be home." The strong wind made trees bend low, and it flattened the flowers to the ground. Hans was quite cold by now, and he had to hold on to his hat to keep it from blowing away. "I hope Mother won't be upset when I arrive home so cold and wet and muddy," he thought. Hans kept his head down against the wind as he trudged along the road. It was so dark that Hans did not know where he was until he lifted his head and saw the dike in front of him. This meant that he would be home very soon. Even through the raindrops, Hans noticed that something was wrong with the dike. He could see a small hole in the wall, allowing a trickle of water to seep through. Hans knew immediately what must have happened. The storm had whipped up big waves in the sea on the other side of the dike. The pounding water had caused the walls to crack. Hans knew he had to warn everyone in town that the dike had sprung a leak. They were in great danger. He ran into town yelling, "The dike is breaking! Help! We must repair the dike!" But no one heard him. All of the townspeople were snug in their homes. Every house and store in town was shut up tight against the storm. The doors were bolted and the windows were shuttered to protect against the wind and the rain. Hans realized that no one could hear his cries. He stopped running, caught his breath, and considered what to do. He knew his mother must be worried about him, but the hole in the dike was growing bigger every minute. Hans knew that if the hole got too big, the sea would break through and wash away the town. As fast as he could, Hans ran back to the place where he had seen the water seeping through the dike. Just as he thought, the crack had grown bigger. Hans knew that the crack must be fixed right away. He could think of nothing else to do, so Hans balled up his fist and pushed it into the hole to stop the seawater from pouring through. Hans felt proud as he stood there, holding back the sea. He was sure that his mother would send people to look for him. But minutes turned into hours as Hans stood there patiently protecting the dike. As darkness fell, Hans was very cold and tired. His arm had begun to ache, and he had to force himself to remain standing. He thought about the warmth of the fireplace at home as he stood in the cold rain by the dike. Then he thought how good it would feel to lie down in his own little bed. When Hans did not come home that evening, his mother began to worry. As the rain fell, she kept watch, hoping Hans would return. Eventually, she decided that Hans must have stayed at Mr. von Notten's house while waiting for the storm to pass. Early the next morning, Mr. von Notten walked to Hans's house. He wanted to thank Hans for his visit yesterday and thank his mother for the tasty food. When he came upon Hans, the brave little boy was trembling with cold. Hans's arm hurt from the effort of keeping his fist wedged in the hole, and his legs were ready to collapse from standing all night. Still, Hans had to hold on just for a little while longer, while Mr. Van Notten ran into town to alert the townspeople and find some help. "Don't worry, Hans," said Mr. Van Notten. "I will be back as soon as I can." "You are doing fine. Just hang on a little longer." Soon Mr. Van Notten returned with some help. The townspeople began working to repair the dike as Mr. Van Notten wrapped Hans in blankets and carried him home to his mother. She put Hans to bed and gave him some warm broth to drink. Then she rubbed his fingers and his stiff legs to warm them up. Word quickly spread about the town about how the brave Hans had held back the sea all by himself. The townspeople were very curious. They went to the dike to see the hole that Hans had plugged. As soon as Hans was warm and felt strong enough, he and his mother took a trip to the dike to see the repairs as they were being made. Everyone was overjoyed to see Hans. They gave him gifts fit for a hero. They shook his hand and marveled that he had been able to hold back the sea all by himself. Over and over again they thanked him for saving them from a terrible flood. Hans was very proud. He never imagined that he might one day save his town. His mother smiled out at him. She was very proud too. The town's mayor held a beautiful ceremony for Hans. He presented the boy with a medal in honor of the strength and courage he had shown in the grave face of danger. Everyone cheered loudly. They were also proud of young Hans. Years later, after Hans had grown into a young man, people continued to call him the little boy with the big heart. To this day, he has not been forgotten, and the town is still saved. Now we're going to finish today's stories with another very cool classic, another one that everybody knows, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time, in a peaceful kingdom by the sea, the king and queen were blessed with a baby girl. Her hair was black as night, her lips were red as rubies, and her skin was white as snow. The queen named her Snow White. There was great rejoicing throughout the kingdom, but the joy soon turned to mourning when the queen fell ill and died. After many months, the king remarried. However, the woman he chose to be his bride was very different from Snow White's mother. The new queen was wicked and vain. She cared for nothing but her own beauty. Every morning the queen would visit her magic mirror and ask the same question. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this realm is the fairest of all?" Every morning the magic mirror replied, "You are my queen, are the fairest of them all." For years, the mirror gave the same answer to the queen's question. The queen gave no thought to Snow White, who was growing into a beautiful young woman. Beloved by everyone in the kingdom, Snow White was as gentle and kind as she was lovely. One day the queen visited the mirror and asked the usual question. This time she received a different answer. "You, my queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but Snow White is 1,000 times more fair." Mad with jealousy, the queen sent for the royal huntsman. She ordered him to take Snow White into the forest and kill her at once. Fearing for his life, the huntsman took Snow White into the woods. When she looked up at him with her gentle eyes full of trust, the huntsman could not bring himself to carry out the queen's order. He left Snow White in the forest and warned her never to return to the castle. The sky grew dark as Snow White wandered deeper and deeper into the forest. Her dress caught on the brush, and she heard a wolf howl in the distance. Snow White was terribly frightened, but she willed herself to continue walking. Just when Snow White feared that she could not take another step, she found herself in a clearing beside a tiny cottage. She knocked once on the wooden door, but there was no answer. The force of her knock caused the door to swing open, and Snow White stepped inside. She saw 7 little cups and 7 little plates on a table surrounded by 7 little chairs. 7 little nightshirts hung on 7 little hooks, and along one wall stood 7 little beds. The cottage was cozy but untidy. Perhaps if I tidy this little cottage, she thought, no one would mind if I have a bit of dinner and warm myself by the fire. Snow White cleaned the cottage until it shone. Only then did she take a bit of bread. She sat down on one of the beds to wait for someone to come home. Snow White was so tired, and the bed was so cozy, that she soon fell fast asleep. While she slept, 7 dwarfs came into the clearing. They sang and talked as they opened the door, but fell silent at the sight of the maiden sleeping on their bed. She looked so peaceful that they let her sleep. Snow White awoke to find herself surrounded by 7 kind faces. The dwarfs welcomed her to the cottage and asked how she found their home. Snow White told the dwarfs about the evil queen and her flight through the dark forest. The dwarfs took pity on Snow White and asked her to stay with them. She was happy to keep their house tidy and make supper for the dwarfs. Back at the castle, the evil queen gazed into her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this realm is the fairest of all?" The mirror replied, "You, my queen, have a beauty quite rare, but beyond the mountains, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is thriving, and this I must tell. Within this realm she's still 1,000 times more fair." The queen flew into a rage. She began to search for Snow White. When the queen found the cottage in the clearing, she disguised herself as a poor seamstress, calling out, "Gowns for sale." Snow White welcomed the seamstress and tried on one of the lovely dresses. The evil queen pulled the laces so tight that Snow White could not breathe, and she fell to the floor, bound in the lovely gown. The dwarfs came home that evening to find Snow White lying motionless on the ground. They quickly cut the laces that stifled her, and to their great relief, she breathed deeply and opened her eyes. That night, the queen triumphantly asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this realm is the fairest of all?" And again the mirror replied with the same answer, "Snow White was fairer than the queen." White with rage, the queen filled the teeth of her prettiest comb with deadly poison. The next morning she disguised herself as a peddler and set out through the woods to the little cottage. Snow White welcomed the peddler into the cottage and admired the silver combs. The queen selected the most beautiful one and gently brushed Snow White's long black hair. The moment the comb touched her head, Snow White fell to the ground and her hair tangled around her, black as night. When the dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White on the floor. As the sad dwarfs carried Snow White to her bed, the comb fell from her hair. She opened her eyes and smiled up at them. The dwarfs were rejoiced, but they were worried that the queen would try to harm Snow White again. They made Snow White promise not to open the door for anyone but themselves. The queen returned to the mirror and gazed proudly at her reflection. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this realm is the fairest of all?" Again, the mirror answered that Snow White was 1,000 times more fair than the queen. Shaking with fury, the queen thought for a very long time. Finally, she had an idea that would not fail. The queen plucked the finest apple from the orchard and poisoned the shiniest half. She disguised herself as a poor farmer woman and set off through the woods, carrying a basket of apples on her arm. "Apples for sale," the queen called from the courtyard. This time, Snow White heeded the 7 dwarfs and did not open the door. Snow White spoke to the farmer woman from the window. "Thank you, good woman," she said, "but I have no need for apples today." The queen replied, "These are not just any apples. She held the poisoned apple up to the window and said, "These are the reddest and ripest apples in the kingdom. There is nothing to fear. I will show you." The queen cut the apple in half and ate the unpoisoned half for herself. She offered the other half through the window to Snow White. Snow White thanked her kindly, certain that such a lovely apple posed no threat. She took one bite and fell lifeless to the ground, her skin as pale as snow. The queen smiled and slipped off into the woods, filled with satisfaction. This time, when the dwarfs returned home, they could do nothing to wake Snow White. She looked as peaceful and pretty as if she were sleeping. The dwarfs wept for a very long time, and then they placed Snow White in a glass case so they could watch over her while they worked. One day a handsome prince rode through the forest and saw Snow White sleeping. Startled, he asked the dwarfs, "Who is this beautiful lady? How did she come to be here?" The dwarfs told him about Snow White and the wicked queen, and how they could do nothing to awaken her. The prince replied, "I will take her to my castle until she awakens. Then, if she is willing, I will ask her to be my wife." He hitched the glass case to his horse, and the dwarfs accompanying him on the way to his castle. As they rode through the forest, the case jostled and the bit of poisoned apple fell from Snow White's mouth. Her eyes fluttered open, and then she smiled up at the prince. The wedding celebration lasted for many days, and there was great rejoicing in the kingdom. There were dances and feasts, and Snow White was happier than she had ever been. While the kingdom celebrated, the evil queen crept into the forest and was never seen again. Snow White and her prince ruled the kingdom with kindness and wisdom and lived happily ever after. And that is all we're going to read for tonight. And I hope you enjoy my stories. Please leave a comment below, hit the like button, ring the bell so you know when I'm reading again, and leave a comment on what you would like to hear. For now, that's all we have. Have a good day, everybody. Have a good day. Stay safe, stay well, stay home, be kind to each other, and enjoy the stories. Bye-bye.